billionaire pretended to sleep, to test his wife and child. But what happened next froze him. "Daddy, I made you something." The small voice cut through the darkness of the bedroom like a knife through silk. Dax Holloway lay motionless in his king-sized bed, every muscle in his body screaming to move, to respond, to reach for his daughter. But he remained frozen, his breathing slow and measured, his eyes shut tight against the sight he knew would destroy him. "I know you can't hear me," the voice continued, trembling now. "Mama said you're in the deep sleep, but I need to tell you something before you wake up. Before you send me back," those 4 words, "before you send me back," they detonated in Dax's chest like a grenade, shrapnel tearing through every assumption he'd made, every justification he'd constructed for this sick test he'd devised. His 8-year-old daughter, Reverie, believed he was going to abandon her, and he was lying there, pretending to be unconscious, listening to her confess her deepest fear while he played detective in his own home. This is what happens when you turn love into an investigation. When you treat your family like a corporate merger that needs due diligence. When you're so afraid of being betrayed that you become the betrayer. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. Not last night when Dax closed his eyes and opened his ears, but 6 months earlier, when a single conversation planted a seed of doubt that would grow into a forest of suspicion thick enough to choke out the light. If this story grips your heart the way it gripped mine, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a mirror. And sometimes we need to see our reflections to understand what we're becoming. 6 months ago, the Peninsula Hotel, Manhattan, the annual Innovators Gala, where people with too much money gathered to celebrate people with even more money. Dax Holloway stood near the bar, a glass of 30-year-old scotch in his hand that he hadn't touched. He didn't drink at these events, he observed. At 46 years old, Dax had built Holloway Technologies from a single patent into a $7 billion empire. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, drone logistics. He had his fingers in every pie that mattered, and his company's stock price reflected it. But success, real success, doesn't come from intelligence alone. It comes from paranoia, from assuming everyone wants what you have, from trusting your instincts when they whisper that something isn't right. That night, his instincts were screaming. He'd stepped away from the main ballroom to take a call from his head of security. A potential breach in their server systems, false alarm, but it required his attention. When he'd finished the call, he'd walked past one of the private sitting rooms off the main corridor. The door was ajar. Voices drifted out. He recognized them immediately. Marcus Stahl, CEO of Stahl Industries, one of Dax's main competitors. And Gerald Chen, a venture capitalist who'd tried and failed to get a seat on Holloway Technologies' board 3 times. Dax had started to walk past. He didn't care what his rivals discussed. But then he heard his own name. Holloway's getting soft. That was Marcus. His voice carrying that particular smugness of a man who'd inherited his wealth and thought it made him superior. Did you see him with that wife of his, parading her around like she's some kind of trophy? Gerald laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. Paloma, that's her name, right? The humanitarian worker he picked up in some disaster zone? Please. A 34-year-old woman doesn't marry a man 12 years older unless she's doing the math on his life expectancy. Dax had frozen in the hallway. His hand tightened around his phone until the case cracked slightly. And that kid, Marcus again. The adopted one, Reverie. Interesting choice. Adopting a child right around the time his company went public. Excellent PR move, I'll give him that. Nothing says I'm a good person like saving an orphan. You think it's really about optics? I think it's about control. Marcus's voice dropped lower, more conspiratorial. Holloway built his entire empire on calculated risks and strategic moves. You think he does anything without an angle? The wife gives him legitimacy, makes him look stable, family-oriented. The kid gives him sympathy points. And meanwhile, Paloma gets access to infinite wealth, and the girl gets rescued from whatever third-world orphanage she came from. Everyone wins. Except Holloway doesn't know the game clock is ticking. Gerald said. How long do you think before Paloma realizes she can take half his fortune in a divorce? She's young. She's attractive. She could start over with billions and find some younger model to spend it with. They'd both laughed at that. The sound had made Dax's stomach turn. He'd walked away before he did something stupid. Before he pushed open that door and reminded both of them that he'd destroyed better men than them for less offensive transgressions. He'd returned to the ballroom, found Paloma talking with a group of nonprofit directors, her face animated as she discussed clean water initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa. He'd watched her from across the room. Really watched her. She'd been wearing an emerald green dress that night. Simple, elegant, nothing flashy. She didn't wear the jewelry he'd bought her, the pieces worth more than most people's houses. She'd told him once that she felt uncomfortable dripping in diamonds when she spent her days thinking about people who didn't have clean drinking water. He'd found it charming then. Now, standing in that ballroom with Marcus's words echoing in his head, Dax had wondered, was it genuine or was it performance? The humble wife who didn't care about money, making herself indispensable by being different from every other woman in his tax bracket. Dax. Paloma had spotted him, her face breaking into a smile that lit up her entire expression. She'd excused herself from her conversation and crossed the ballroom to him. You disappeared. Everything okay? Fine, he'd said. Just business. She'd studied his face with those dark, perceptive eyes that had first caught his attention 3 years ago. You sure? You look tense. I'm always tense at these things. You know that. She'd slipped her hand into his. Then let's leave. We've made our appearance. Reverie's probably driving the babysitter crazy with questions about the universe or whatever existential crisis 8-year-olds have these days. He'd let her lead him out. Let her chatter in the car about the people she'd met, the projects she was excited about, and the entire time, a small voice in the back of his mind had whispered, "What if they're right? What if you're the only one who doesn't see it?" That voice had grown louder over the following weeks. Dax had started noticing things. Small things. Paloma's phone, face down on the counter. Why face down unless she was hiding something? Her weekly therapy appointments that she'd started 3 months ago. What was she discussing with a stranger that she couldn't discuss with him? The way she'd become more independent, taking on a part-time consulting role with a relief organization. Was she building her own financial foundation, preparing for an exit strategy? And Reverie, his daughter, the little girl he'd adopted as a 6-year-old from an orphanage in Guatemala. He'd fallen in love with her the moment he'd seen her photo, this serious-faced child with eyes too old for her age. Paloma had been volunteering there when they'd met, and she'd introduced him to Reverie during his visit. 3 months later, they were a family. But now Dax found himself watching Reverie with clinical detachment, analyzing. She didn't look like him. Obviously, she was adopted, but people always commented on it. Strangers, acquaintances, even family friends. She's so exotic looking. Where did you say she was from again? Does she speak English well? As if his daughter was some rare bird he'd imported. Did it bother her? Did she feel like she didn't belong? And if she did, whose fault was that? His, for not being enough? Or was there something else going on? Some dynamic he was missing because he was too busy building empires to pay attention to his own home? The paranoia had metastasized into obsession. Dax had hired a private investigator. He wasn't proud of it, but he'd done it. Check Paloma's background again, more thoroughly this time. Look for connections, debts, former relationships, anything that might indicate motive. The investigator had come back with nothing. Paloma Reeves was exactly who she appeared to be. Daughter of 2 school teachers from Oregon, full scholarship to Berkeley, master's degree in international development. 10 years working for various NGOs in conflict and disaster zones. No secret debts, no suspicious connections, no hidden agenda. Clean. Too clean, the paranoid voice whispered. Dax had gone further. He'd accessed his own home security system. They had cameras throughout the house for security purposes, but he'd never actively monitored them. Now he did. He'd watched footage of Paloma and Reverie during the day when he was at work. He'd fast-forwarded through hours of mundane domesticity. Breakfast, homework, Paloma working at the kitchen table on her laptop, Reverie drawing, reading, playing in the garden. Nothing. No suspicious phone calls, no secret meetings, no evidence of deception, But the voice wouldn't stop. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. What if she knows about the cameras? What if she's performing even when you're not there, just in case? It was insane. Dax knew it was insane, but he couldn't stop. The final straw had come 2 weeks ago. An anonymous letter delivered to his office. Plain envelope, typed message, untraceable. You should ask your wife about her therapy sessions. Specifically, ask her what she's planning. Some things aren't about healing. They're about preparing. That was it. No signature, no additional context. Just enough to twist the knife that was already lodged in his gut. Dax had nearly thrown it away. This was obviously someone trying to manipulate him. A competitor, a disgruntled former employee, someone with an agenda. But that night, lying in bed next to Paloma, listening to her breathe in the darkness, he'd felt the weight of doubt crushing his chest. What if the letter was right? What if there was something he was missing? What if everyone could see the truth except him? He'd made a decision. One final test. Something that would reveal the truth once and for all. He'd told Paloma the next morning over breakfast. Casual, throwaway, like it didn't matter. I have to start a new medication, he'd said, poking at his eggs Benedict. For the insomnia. Dr. Richardson finally convinced me. Paloma had looked up from her coffee, concerned. Medication? Dax, you know how you react to sleep aids. You hate feeling groggy. This is different. It's new. Some kind of targeted neurotransmitter thing. I don't understand the science. But he warned me it might make me sleep really deeply. Like, I might not wake up even if there's noise or movement around me. That sounds intense. Are you sure that's safe? He monitored me in the office. It's fine. I'll just be really out of it. He'd glanced at Reverie, who was concentrating fiercely on making a tower out of her orange slices. He'd lowered his voice. If anything happens, if there's an emergency, you might have to really shake me to wake me up, just so you know. Okay. Paloma had reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Thank you for telling me. When do you start? Tonight, actually. Might as well get it over with. Reverie had looked up then, her dark eyes wide. Daddy. Will you be okay? You won't stop breathing or anything. Dax's heart had clenched. Of course not, little bird. I'll just be sleeping really well for once. You know how I usually wake up if a moth sneezes 3 blocks away. She'd giggled at that, but there'd been worry in her expression. Promise? I promise. He'd been lying, of course. There was no medication, no insomnia treatment, just a man setting a trap for the people he claimed to love. That night, Dax had gone through his usual routine. Dinner with the family, Reverie's bath time, which he usually helped with, making sculptures out of soap bubbles while she narrated elaborate stories about underwater kingdoms. Reading time, where they'd continued their current book, a fantasy novel about a girl who discovered she had magic powers she didn't know how to control. Do you think she's scared? Reverie had asked, snuggled against his side. The girl in the story? About having powers? Probably, Dax had said. Power is scary, especially when you don't understand it. But she's lucky she has it, Reverie had said. She can do things other people can't. She's special. Everyone's special in their own way, little bird. Reverie had been quiet for a moment. Daddy, do you think I'm special? The question had stabbed him. I think you're the most special person in the entire world. Even though I'm not really yours? Dax had put the book down, turned to face his daughter fully. She'd shrugged, not meeting his eyes. Kids at school. They say adopted kids aren't real kids. They say our real parents didn't want us, and our new parents just feel sorry for us. Dax had felt rage build in his chest. Which kids? Give me names. Daddy, it's fine. It's not fine. Reverie, look at me. She'd raised her eyes to his. You are my real daughter. Adoption doesn't make you less mine. It makes you more mine because I chose you. Do you understand? I chose you. She'd nodded, but there'd been something in her expression. Some shadow of doubt that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and he'd just never noticed. He'd held her tighter than usual when he'd tucked her in, kissed her forehead twice instead of once. And when he'd left her room, he'd stood in the hallway for a long moment, wondering what kind of monster he was becoming. But he hadn't stopped, hadn't called off his plan. At 10:30, he'd told Paloma he was taking the medication. He'd gone into the bathroom, run the tap, waited an appropriate amount of time, then returned to the bedroom. "Okay," he'd said, climbing into bed. "Here goes nothing. If I start snoring like a chainsaw, you have my permission to smother me with a pillow." Paloma had laughed, setting aside her book. "I'll resist the temptation." She'd leaned over and kissed him. "Sweet dreams, love." He'd closed his eyes, regulated his breathing, slowed it down to the rhythm of deep sleep, and waited. For the first hour, nothing had happened. Paloma had continued reading beside him, occasionally shifting position, the lamp on her side of the bed casting a warm glow that he could sense even through his closed eyelids. Around 11:30, she'd turned off the light. He'd felt her settle into her pillow, her breathing gradually slowing as she drifted towards sleep. Dax had waited, every sense heightened. This was it, the moment of truth. If she was going to reveal her true self, it would be now. When she thought he was completely unconscious and unaware, midnight came and went. Paloma slept, or seemed to sleep. Dax's neck was starting to cramp from holding the same position, but he didn't move. Then, around 12:45, he'd felt the mattress shift. Paloma was moving. His heart rate had spiked, but he'd kept his breathing steady. "Don't blow it now. Don't move." He'd heard her footsteps, soft on the carpet. She'd walked around to his side of the bed. He'd felt her presence, close, looming over him. This was it. She was going to check his phone, or his wallet. Or maybe go to his study and access his computer. All the things a wife planning her exit strategy would do when given the perfect opportunity. But she didn't move toward his nightstand. Instead, he'd felt her hand, gentle, touching his forehead. Her fingers had brushed his hair back from his face, a gesture so tender it had made his chest ache. Then he'd heard something that had stopped his heart entirely. Paloma was crying. Not loud, racking sobs, just quiet tears, the kind you shed when you think no one is watching, when you don't have to perform strength. "I don't know what's happening to us," she'd whispered, her voice so soft he'd barely heard it. "I don't know what I did wrong." Dax had wanted to open his eyes, wanted to reach for her. But he'd forced himself to remain still. "You've been slipping away from me for months," Paloma had continued, looking at me like I'm a stranger. "Like you're waiting for me to prove something. And I don't even know what the test is." Her hand had remained in his hair, stroking gently. "I love you," she'd said. "I have loved you since the day you sat with Reverie in that orphanage and braided her hair because she asked you to, and you didn't care that you had a meeting with the president of Guatemala in an hour. I loved you when you learned Spanish in 3 months, just so you could read bedtime stories to her in her first language. I loved you when you cried the day the adoption was finalized because you said you'd never thought you'd be a father." Dax's carefully controlled breathing had nearly faltered. "I didn't marry you for your money." Paloma's voice had broken. "I married you because you saw me. Really saw me. Not as some martyr doing charity work, not as someone to be saved or fixed, but as an equal. As someone whose work mattered, whose opinions mattered." She'd been quiet for a moment, and he'd heard her wipe her eyes. "But now I feel invisible, like you're looking through me, searching for something that isn't there, some evidence of betrayal, some proof that I'm not who I say I am." His wife had bent down, pressed her lips to his forehead. "I started therapy because I thought maybe I was crazy, maybe I was imagining the distance. But Dr. Ainsworth says I'm not imagining it. She says you're pulling away, and I need to decide whether I'm going to keep reaching for someone who doesn't want to be reached." Paloma had straightened up. "But here's the thing, Dax. I'm not going anywhere. I don't care if you believe me or not. I don't care if you've convinced yourself I'm some kind of con artist. I'm staying. Because I made a vow. And because Reverie needs at least one parent who isn't broken by their past." That last sentence had hit like a physical blow. She'd walked back to her side of the bed, climbed in, and within minutes, her breathing had evened out into sleep. Dax had lain there in the darkness, his mind spinning. That wasn't what he'd expected. That wasn't the reaction of a woman with something to hide. That was the response of someone in pain. Someone who'd been hurt by his suspicion and was still choosing to stay. But the test wasn't over. There was still Reverie. He'd waited another hour. His entire body ached from forced stillness. He'd briefly worried that he might actually fall asleep, ruin his own experiment through sheer exhaustion. Then he'd heard the door open again. Smaller footsteps this time. A child's footsteps. "Mama?" Reverie's voice, barely above a whisper. He'd felt Paloma stir. "Baby? What's wrong? Why are you awake?" "I can't sleep. Can I come in?" "Of course. Come here." The mattress had dipped as Reverie had climbed up, settling between them. Dax had felt her small body press against his side. "Is Daddy okay?" Reverie had asked. "He's breathing funny. He's just in a very deep sleep, sweetheart. The medication he took. Remember he told us? What if he doesn't wake up? He'll wake up. I promise." There'd been a pause. Then Reverie had said, "Mama, can I tell Daddy something? Even if he can't hear?" Paloma's voice had been soft, indulgent. "Of course you can." This was the moment. The moment that would either validate Dax's paranoia or destroy it entirely. Reverie had shifted, turning toward him. He'd felt her hand touch his arm, tentative, careful. "Daddy," she'd started. "I made you something." And that's where this story truly began. With those words, with what came next. "Daddy, I made you something," Reverie had said again. "It's a book. I've been working on it for 3 months. Mama helped me with the hard words." Dax had felt something placed on his chest. Something light, homemade. Paper and cardboard. "It's called 100 Reasons to Keep Me." Reverie's voice had been matter-of-fact, but there'd been a tremor underneath. "It's like coupons, but not for things, for reasons." Paloma's sharp intake of breath had been audible. "Reverie, baby, what are you talking about?" "It's okay, Mama, I know." "Know what?" "I heard Daddy on the phone, 2 weeks ago. I was supposed to be asleep, but I came downstairs to get water, and he was in his office. The door was open a little. He was talking about paperwork and making sure and background checks." "Oh, God." Paloma's voice had been filled with horror. "Reverie, no. That's not what you think. It's okay," Reverie had insisted. "I'm not mad. I know I'm expensive. I heard kids at school talk about how much their parents spend on them. Food and clothes and school and doctors. And I know I'm not really his. I'm just the girl he adopted because you asked him to." "That's not true." Paloma had been crying now. "Reverie, that's not true at all." But Dax's mind had been reeling. 2 weeks ago, he'd been on the phone with a private investigator, going over findings, asking about more background checks. His daughter had heard. She'd misunderstood everything. "It's okay, Mama," Reverie had repeated. "I understand. Rich people have to be careful. They have to make sure. And maybe Daddy found out something bad about me. Maybe he found out my real parents were criminals or something. Maybe that's why he's been sad when he looks at me." "No," Paloma had pulled Reverie close. "No, baby, that's not it at all. But I want him to know." Reverie's voice had strengthened with determination. "I want him to know that even if he sends me back, I understand, and I won't be mad. Because he gave me 3 whole years of being loved, and that's more than lots of kids get." Dax had felt his eyes burning behind his closed lids. This was his daughter. His little bird. And she thought he was planning to abandon her. "The book has things like," Reverie had continued, clearly reading from her handmade creation. "Reason number 5, I only cried twice last week. Reason number 17, I can be quiet for hours if you need me to be. Reason number 42, I don't eat very much, so I don't cost too much for food." Each item was a knife to Dax's heart. Reason number 68. She'd gone on. "I can sleep in a smaller room if you need the space." Reason number 73. "I won't ask about my real parents anymore if it makes you uncomfortable." "Stop," Paloma had choked out. "Reverie, please stop. I just want him to know I can be better. I can be so much better. I can be the kind of daughter he wants. You're already perfect. But I'm not. I'm not his real daughter. I don't look like him. People always stare at us when we're together. I heard a lady at the grocery store ask if you were my nanny because we don't look related. People are ignorant and cruel. That has nothing to do with your worth. But maybe Daddy is tired of people staring. Maybe he's tired of explaining. Maybe he wants a real family. You are his real family. We are his real family. Reverie had been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said something that shattered what remained of Dax's carefully constructed walls. Mama, if Daddy sends me back, will you still visit me sometimes? At the orphanage? Or will you have to stay with him and forget about me? Paloma had sobbed at that, loud, broken, unable to contain it. Nobody is sending you anywhere. I promise you. I swear on my life. You are wanted. You are loved. You are ours. But what if Daddy doesn't think so? Then Daddy is wrong. Reverie had laid down then, her head on Dax's chest, right over his heart that was fracturing with every beat. I left the book here, she'd said softly. So when he wakes up, he can read it. And maybe he'll change his mind. Maybe he'll see that I'm trying really hard. She'd been silent for a moment, then added, I also brought my music box, the one from my birth mama. It's real silver, Mama said so. He can sell it if he needs money. Maybe then he won't be so stressed about taking care of me. Dax had felt the small object placed next to the handmade book on his chest, the music box he'd watched her treasure for 3 years. The only connection she had to her biological mother. She was offering it up like a sacrifice. I love you, Daddy, Reverie had whispered. Even if you don't love me back anymore, I love you. You're the best daddy I ever had. You're the only daddy I ever had. And I know I'm supposed to say forever, but I know forever might not be real for kids like me, so I'll just say thank you. Thank you for 3 years. Thank you for making me feel special, even if I'm not. She'd kissed his chest, right where his heart was shattering into a million pieces. Good night. Paloma had gathered Reverie close. Let's get you back to bed, sweet girl. Can I stay here? Just tonight? I want to be close to him. Of course you can stay. They'd both settled in beside him. Within 20 minutes, both of their breathing had evened into sleep. Reverie curled against his side, Paloma's arm protectively around them both, and Dax had lain there, eyes closed, unable to move, unable to breathe properly, unable to do anything except feel the weight of what he'd done crushing him. He'd tested his family, and in doing so, he'd revealed not their flaws, but his own. He'd been so afraid of being deceived that he'd become the deceiver, so afraid of being abandoned that he'd made his daughter believe she was disposable, so afraid of being used that he'd pushed away someone who'd only ever loved him. The anonymous letter, the overheard conversation, the seeds of doubt, none of it mattered. Because even if there'd been truth in any of it, what he'd done tonight was unforgivable. He'd turned love into an experiment. He'd treated his wife and daughter like suspects instead of family. And the worst part? They'd both passed his sick test with flying colors. Paloma hadn't touched his wallet, hadn't checked his phone. She'd cried over their failing marriage and chosen to stay anyway. Reverie hadn't stolen anything, hadn't complained or acted out. She'd made a book of reasons to keep her, offering up everything she had to make herself worthy of love she should never have had to earn. The hours crawled by. Dax remained motionless, but inside, he was collapsing. Every assumption he'd made, every suspicion he'd harbored, every wall he'd built, all of it was revealed as nothing more than the defense mechanisms of a broken man too damaged by his past to recognize genuine love when it was offered freely. Because Dax had his own history, his own wounds. He'd never told Paloma the full truth about his childhood. She knew he'd grown up in foster care, but she didn't know the details. Didn't know about the 7 different homes between ages 6 and 15. Didn't know about the families who'd fostered him only for the monthly check. About the ones who'd returned him like defective merchandise when he'd proven too difficult, too traumatized, too much work. He'd been adopted once. At age 14, the Montgomerys. Nice family. 2 biological kids. Big house in Connecticut. They'd seemed perfect. They'd seemed genuine. Dax had let himself hope. It had lasted 11 months. Then Mr. Montgomery had lost his job. Money had gotten tight. And one day, Mrs. Montgomery had sat Dax down at the kitchen table and explained, very gently, very apologetically, that they couldn't afford to keep him anymore. They were so sorry. They hoped he understood. It wasn't personal. He'd been back in the group home by that evening. That experience had taught Dax everything he needed to know about permanence. It didn't exist. Love was conditional. Family was temporary. Everyone had a breaking point where you stopped being worth the investment. So he'd stopped investing in people. He'd invested in himself instead. Education, business, success, things he could control, things that couldn't reject him. Meeting Paloma had been accidental. He'd been in Guatemala for business, touring a manufacturing facility. There'd been an earthquake. Not massive, but significant enough to cause damage in the surrounding villages. His meeting had been canceled. And instead of flying home, something had compelled him to volunteer with the relief effort. That's where he'd seen her, Paloma. Covered in dust, organizing supply distribution with calm efficiency while chaos swirled around her. She'd been magnificent, focused, unshakable. When he'd approached to ask how he could help, she'd looked him up and down, noted his expensive watch and designer clothes, and said, "Can you lift heavy things without complaining? If not, I need you to get out of the way." He'd fallen in love with her in that moment. They'd worked side by side for 3 days, and he'd seen something in her he'd never seen before. Authenticity. She didn't care who he was, didn't care about his net worth. She cared about clean water and medical supplies and making sure every family had shelter. On the 3rd day, she'd taken him to the orphanage where she'd been volunteering for 6 months. That's where he'd met Reverie. This tiny 6-year-old with enormous eyes and a serious expression. She'd been sitting alone in the corner of the courtyard while other children played, drawing in the dirt with a stick. Paloma had crouched beside her. "Reverie, I brought someone to meet you. This is Dax. He's visiting from very far away." Reverie had looked up at him, studied him with unnerving intensity for a 6-year-old. Then she'd said, in careful English, "Are you going to adopt someone?" "I don't know," Dax had answered honestly. "I haven't thought about it. You should adopt me. I'm very good. I can read. And I don't cry at night anymore." Dax's heart had cracked open. "Why me?" "Because you have kind eyes. And because you're still here." Most visitors leave after 1 day. He'd stayed another week. He'd spent every afternoon at that orphanage, reading to Reverie, playing with her, learning her story. She'd been abandoned at 3 years old, left at a church with a note and a silver music box. She'd spent 3 years in the system. 3 years learning that she was temporary. When Dax had told Paloma he wanted to adopt Reverie, she'd been cautious. "This is a huge decision. You can't do this on impulse. This is a child's life." "I know. And I've never been more certain of anything." The adoption process had taken 9 months. 9 months of paperwork and home visits and background checks. 9 months during which Dax had also been courting Paloma, taking slow, deliberate steps toward building something real. They'd gotten married a month after Reverie's adoption was finalized. Small ceremony, just the 3 of them and a handful of close friends. It had been the happiest day of Dax's life, standing there with Paloma and Reverie, his family, his choice, his new beginning. And he'd nearly destroyed it. Nearly thrown it all away because he'd let old wounds dictate present choices. Because he'd allowed Marcus and Gerald's poison to infect his mind. Because he'd received an anonymous letter and decided to believe it over 3 years of evidence to the contrary. Lying there in the darkness, Dax made a decision. When morning came, he couldn't tell them the truth, couldn't admit what he'd done. That confession would serve only to ease his guilt while inflicting more pain on them. They'd never trust him again, never feel safe. They'd always wonder if he was testing them. No, he had to carry this. This would be his burden, his secret shame. And he would spend the rest of his life making up for it without them ever knowing there was anything to make up for. But first, he had to end this test. Had to wake up. Had to face his daughter's book and his wife's tears and figure out how to repair damage they didn't even know he'd caused. As the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the curtains, Dax felt Reverie stir. She sat up slowly, carefully, trying not to wake anyone. He sensed her looking at him, checking if he was still breathing. Then she did something that made his carefully maintained facade almost crumble entirely. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, whispered, "Please wake up happy, Daddy. Please don't be sad today. Please remember that we love you even if you don't love us the same way." She'd slipped out of bed then, padded quietly toward the door. Before leaving, she'd turned back. He'd heard her voice, so soft he almost missed it. "I'm sorry I'm not enough. I'll try harder." Then she was gone. Dax had lain there, a grown man, a billionaire, a person who controlled rooms full of powerful people with a single word, and he'd felt more powerless than he'd ever felt in his entire life, because his daughter believed she needed to try harder to be worthy of love. And it was entirely his fault. Paloma woke shortly after. She'd turned toward him, studied his sleeping face. He'd felt her fingers trace his jawline. "Come back to us," she'd whispered. "Wherever you've gone in that brilliant, damaged mind of yours. Come back. We miss you. I miss you." She'd pressed a kiss to his temple. Then she'd risen, gathered herself, and followed Reverie out of the room. Dax had waited another 15 minutes. Then he'd opened his eyes. The room was empty. Morning light painted everything gold. On his chest sat 2 items: a handmade book with construction paper covers and crayon lettering that read 100 Reasons to Keep Me, and a small silver music box, dented and tarnished, worth nothing to anyone except the little girl who'd been willing to trade it for acceptance. Dax had picked up both items. His hands were shaking. He'd opened the book. Reason number 1, I love you with all my heart. Reason number 2, I promise to always be good. Reason number 3, I won't ask for expensive things. On and on it went. 100 reasons, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Each one revealing a child who'd internalized the idea that love was earned through perfect behavior, that family was conditional, that she was always one mistake away from being returned. He'd taught her that. Not intentionally, but through his distance, his distraction, his inability to see what was right in front of him because he'd been so busy protecting himself from imaginary threats. Dax had gotten out of bed. He'd walked to Reverie's room. Her door was ajar. She was sitting at her small desk, already dressed for Saturday morning, working on something, another drawing, another project, always trying to prove her worth. He'd knocked softly. She'd turned, and when she'd seen him standing there, her face had gone pale. "Daddy, you're awake. How do you feel?" Dax had crossed the room. He'd knelt in front of her chair so they were eye level. He'd held up the handmade book. "Did you make this?" Reverie had nodded, her eyes wide, uncertain. "Did you mean every word?" "Yes." "All 100 reasons?" "Yes, sir." Dax had felt tears streak down his face. He hadn't cried in 15 years. But he was crying now, and he didn't try to hide it. "Reverie, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen very carefully. Can you do that for me?" She'd nodded again. "You don't need 100 reasons for me to keep you. You don't need 10 reasons. You don't need 1 reason. Do you know why? Because you already chose me?" "No," Dax had shaken his head. "Because you're mine. Not because of paperwork or adoption certificates. Because the moment I met you, sitting in that courtyard drawing pictures in the dirt, my heart recognized you. You are my daughter. Not my adoptive daughter. Not my chosen daughter. My daughter. Period. Full stop. End of story. But the phone call, the paperwork, I heard you. I know what you heard. And I know what you thought you heard. But you misunderstood, little bird. I wasn't making plans to send you back. I was making plans to bring someone to you." Reverie had looked confused. "Bring who?" "Your brother." Her eyes had gone impossibly wide. "My brother?" "I found him. Santiago. He's 10 now. He's been in a group home in Guatemala City. Same biological mother. Same silver music box left with him. I've been working for 6 months to bring him here. To give you your family back. That's what you heard. Background checks and paperwork for his adoption." Reverie had stared at him. "I have a brother?" "You have a brother. And if you want him here, if you want to meet him, then we're going to bring him home. Because that's what families do. They grow." The little girl had thrown herself at Dax, wrapping her arms around his neck. She'd started sobbing, big, heaving sobs of relief and joy, and released fear. "I thought you didn't want me anymore," she'd cried into his shoulder. "I thought I did something wrong." "No," Dax had held her tight. "I did something wrong. I got lost in my own head. I let my past make me blind to my present, And I am so sorry, little bird. I am so sorry I made you feel like you needed to earn my love. He'd pulled back, looked into her eyes. You never have to try harder. You never have to be perfect. You never have to make yourself smaller or quieter or less expensive. You are wanted exactly as you are. Messy and loud and expensive and perfect. Do you hear me? I hear you. Say it back to me. Say I am wanted. I am wanted. Say I am loved. I am loved. Her voice had gotten stronger. Say I am enough. I am enough. Again. I am enough. Dax had held his daughter while she cried 3 years' worth of tears she'd been holding back. And he'd made silent promises to himself. To be better. To be present. To never again let his damage hurt the people who loved him. When Reverie had finally calmed down, she'd pulled back and wiped her eyes. As soon as the final paperwork clears. Probably 3 weeks. What if he doesn't like me? Impossible. You're extremely likable. What if I'm not a good big sister? Then you'll learn. That's what family does. We learn together. Reverie had picked up the music box from where Dax had set it on her desk. You don't have to sell this. I was wrong. Mama said it's worth keeping because it connects me to my first mama. She said I can love her and love you at the same time. Your mama is very smart. Are you going to marry her again? Dax had laughed. We're already married, little bird. I know. But maybe you should marry her again, like a redo. Because I think she's sad too. I think she needs to know she's wanted. You're right. Dax had stood up. You're absolutely right. He'd found Paloma in the kitchen, making coffee with mechanical precision. When she'd heard him enter, she'd turned, her face carefully neutral. You're up. How are you feeling? Like I've been asleep for a very long time. And like I just woke up. Paloma had studied him. There was something different in his expression, something raw. Dax had crossed to her. He'd taken the coffee mug from her hands and set it down. Then he'd taken both her hands in his. I need to tell you something. Okay. Her voice had been cautious. You were right. About everything you said last night. Paloma had gone very still. You heard me? I heard you. But the medication. You were supposed to be deeply asleep. There was no medication, Paloma. There was just a test. A sick, twisted test that I devised because I'm broken and paranoid and terrified. He'd seen understanding dawn in her eyes. Followed immediately by hurt. You pretended to be asleep. To test me. Yes. And Reverie? I heard her too. Paloma had pulled her hands away. She'd taken a step back. Her face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. You tested us. You set up a trap for your own family. Yes. Why? Her voice had broken. Why would you do that? Because. Dax had forced himself to maintain eye contact, to not look away from the pain he'd caused. Because 6 months ago, I overheard people at a gala say that you married me for money. That Reverie was a PR move. And then I got an anonymous letter suggesting you were planning something. And instead of talking to you like a rational human being, I let old wounds take over. I let the scared 14-year-old who got returned by his adoptive family make decisions for the 46-year-old man. Paloma had pressed her hands to her mouth. Oh my God. I know. I know it's unforgivable. I know I've damaged something that might never fully heal. But I need you to know that the test revealed nothing about you. It revealed everything about me. It showed me that I have a family who loves me unconditionally, and I've been too damaged to see it. You made our daughter think you were sending her back. Paloma's voice had risen. She made a book, Dax. 100 Reasons. 100 Ways an 8-year-old tried to prove she deserved to exist in her own home. I know. Do you? Do you really understand what you've done? Yes. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it right. How? Paloma had demanded. How do you make this right? I don't know, Dax had admitted. But I'm going to start by being honest, by going to actual therapy, not surveillance of my family, by trusting instead of testing, by choosing to believe in the love you've shown me, instead of waiting for it to disappear. Paloma had been quiet for a long moment. Then she'd said, I'm so angry at you right now. You should be. I'm hurt. I'm furious. I feel violated. I know. But I also. She'd paused, taken a breath. I also understand. Not the method. Never the method. But the fear. I know you've been hurt. I know trust is hard for you. That's not an excuse. No, it's not, but it's context. She'd looked at him. We need help, real help, couples, therapy, family therapy. This can't happen again. It won't. You can't promise that. Not alone. You need support. We need support. Okay, whatever it takes. Paloma had studied him, searched his face for something. Apparently, she'd found it, because her expression had softened slightly. Santiago, she'd said. You're really bringing him? I'm really bringing him. Dax had allowed himself a small smile. Reverie needs her brother, and I think maybe I need to prove to myself that I can expand my heart instead of guarding it. When? 3 weeks if everything goes smoothly. Does he know about us? He knows he has a sister. He doesn't know she's been found. It's going to be a surprise. Paloma had nodded slowly. Then she'd stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Dax. She'd held him tight. He'd felt her trembling. Don't do that again, she'd whispered. Don't test us. If you have doubts, use your words. If you're scared, tell me. But don't ever make me prove my love like I'm in some kind of trial. Never again, I swear. They'd stood there in the kitchen, holding each other while coffee grew cold and morning light filled the room. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't forgiveness. Not completely. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, that's all you can ask for. 3 weeks. That's how long Dax had to prove he meant what he said. 3 weeks before Santiago arrived and their family expanded. 3 weeks to repair the foundation he'd nearly destroyed. The first thing he did was cancel every meeting that wasn't absolutely critical. His executive team had been shocked when he'd walked into the Monday morning board meeting and announced he was stepping back from day-to-day operations. I'm still CEO, he'd said, looking around the mahogany conference table at faces that couldn't hide their surprise. But I'm delegating more. My family needs me present, not just physically in the house, but mentally and emotionally present. So effective immediately. I'm working from home 3 days a week, and I'm unavailable after 6 p.m. unless there's an actual emergency. And no, a stock price fluctuation doesn't count as an emergency. Marcus Chen, his chief operating officer, had raised an eyebrow. Dax, with the Holbrook merger pending, this seems like unusual timing. The Holbrook merger will happen or it won't. The company will survive either way, but my family won't survive me being an absent ghost who only shows up to sign permission slips and write checks. He'd left the meeting early. Hadn't stayed for the whispered conversations he knew would follow. Didn't care what they thought about his sudden shift in priorities. The second thing he did was find a therapist. Not just any therapist. He'd interviewed 5 before finding Dr. Marcus Webb, a specialist in attachment disorders and childhood trauma. Their first session had been brutal. Tell me about the Montgomerys, Dr. Webb had said, 40 minutes into their initial consultation. Dax had stiffened. How do you know about them? You mentioned foster care and adoption in your intake form. And you have the emotional signature of someone who's been returned. It's a specific kind of wound. Dax had wanted to walk out, but he'd forced himself to stay. To talk. To excavate the 14-year-old version of himself who'd been told he was too much trouble to keep. They seemed perfect, he'd said finally. Rich, stable, 2 kids of their own who seemed nice enough. Big house in Connecticut with a pool and a treehouse. I thought I'd finally found it. The place I'd stay forever. What happened? Mr. Montgomery lost his job, some corporate restructuring thing, and suddenly money was tight. They started having these quiet conversations in the kitchen after they thought I'd gone to bed. About cutting expenses, about difficult choices. Did they tell you themselves that they were planning to return you? Dax had nodded. Mrs. Montgomery sat me down. She cried. Said she was so sorry, that they'd grown to care about me, but they couldn't afford to keep me anymore. Said I'd understand when I was older. How long did you have? Between being told and being sent back. 2 days. Dr. Webb had written something down. That's not enough time to process that kind of loss. I didn't process it. I learned from it. I learned that family is conditional, that love has a price tag, that when things get hard, the foster kid gets returned to save the real family. And now you're a father. with an adopted daughter. Who you've been testing. Dax had felt the walls closing in. I never wanted to hurt her. I just wanted to know if she was real. If any of it was real. Or you wanted to control the inevitable, Dr. Webb had said gently. Better to discover the betrayal on your terms than be blindsided by it later. Better to be the one who leaves than the one who gets left. The accuracy had felt like a physical blow. Mr. Holloway. Dr. Webb had leaned forward. Your daughter isn't going to abandon you. Do you know why? Because she's 8? Because she's the one who was abandoned first. She understands what it feels like. That little girl who wrote you 100 reasons to keep her, she's not trying to earn your love. She's trying to prove she won't hurt you the way she's been hurt. You're both protecting yourselves from the same wound. That session had ended with Dax sitting in his car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, crying in a way he hadn't cried since he was a child. Huge, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep in his chest. Grief for the 14-year-old he'd been. Grief for the damage he'd nearly inflicted on his daughter. Grief for all the years he'd spent building walls instead of bridges. The third thing he did was tell Paloma everything. Not just about the test, but about his childhood. About every foster home. About the Montgomerys. About the ways he'd learned to protect himself that had become prisons keeping everyone else out. They'd been sitting on the terrace of their penthouse. It was late evening, Reverie asleep inside. The city glittered below them like scattered stars. I've never told you the whole story, Dax had said. About before. Paloma had set down her wine glass. I'm listening. So he'd told her. All of it. The houses where he'd been hungry. The ones where he'd been ignored. The one where he'd been hit, just once. But it had been enough to get him removed. The Montgomerys, who'd seemed like salvation and then became his biggest wound. I learned to watch people, he'd said, to analyze their motivations. To spot inconsistencies between what they said and what they did. It made me good at business, made me excellent at reading competitors and negotiating deals. But it also made me see betrayal everywhere, even where it didn't exist. Paloma had taken his hand. I wish you'd told me this before. I thought I had it handled. Thought I'd buried it deep enough that it wouldn't affect us. That's not how trauma works, love. It doesn't stay buried. It just waits for the right trigger to surface. I know that now. She'd been quiet for a moment. Then she'd asked, the anonymous letter, do you still have it? Dax had pulled it from his wallet. He'd been carrying it like evidence. Like proof his paranoia was justified. Paloma had read it. Then she'd pulled out her phone, typed something, and shown him the screen. It was an article. 3 months old. About Gerald Chen's venture capital firm losing a major lawsuit. About his company circling the drain. About his desperate attempts to acquire or destroy competitors to stay afloat. Gerald wanted a seat on your board, Paloma had said. You denied him 3 times. This letter was revenge, pure and simple. He was trying to destabilize you. Dax had stared at the article. I should have seen that. You were primed to believe it because of what you overheard at the gala. And you were vulnerable because of your history. Gerald just exploited existing cracks. How did you find this? I've been doing my own investigation, not of you, of who might be targeting you, because I knew something was wrong, and I knew it wasn't us. Dax had looked at his wife. Really looked at her. This woman who could have walked away when he'd started pulling away, who could have been angry and resentful. Instead, she'd been trying to solve the problem, trying to protect him even while he'd been testing her. I don't deserve you. Probably not. Paloma had smiled slightly. But you're stuck with me anyway. That's what the vows meant, for better or worse, even when worse is you being an idiot. He'd laughed, an actual laugh, the first genuine one in months. The 4th thing he did was take Reverie to therapy. Just the 2 of them, with a child psychologist named Dr. Yolanda Torres who specialized in adoption trauma. Reverie had been nervous at first. Am I in trouble? No, little bird. We're going to talk to someone who helps families understand each other better. Dr. Torres had been warm and approving, her office filled with art supplies and comfortable cushions. She'd started by asking Reverie to draw her family. Dax had watched his daughter carefully select markers. She'd drawn 4 stick figures, one tall, one labeled Daddy, one medium, one labeled Mama, one small, one labeled me, and one even smaller one labeled Santiago, even though they hadn't met him yet. "Tell me about your picture," Dr. Torres had said. "This is my family." Reverie had pointed to each figure. Daddy is the tallest because he's in charge. Mama is strong because she carries heavy things. I'm small because I'm still growing. And Santiago is smallest because he's younger than me, even though he's older. That doesn't make sense, does it? It makes perfect sense to me. Dr. Torres had smiled. Why is he younger even though he's older? Because he's been alone longer, so he needs more taking care of. That's what Daddy said. Your daddy is right. Tell me, Reverie, what does your family like to do together? Read. And sometimes we go to the park. And Mama makes really good pancakes on Sundays. Reverie had paused. We used to do more stuff, but then Daddy got busy. Or sad. I'm not sure which. When did that start? I don't know exactly. Maybe 6 months ago? He started looking at Mama and me different, like we were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Dr. Torres had glanced at Dax. How did that make you feel? Scared. Because in the orphanage, when the workers looked at you like that, it meant they were trying to figure out what was wrong with you. And if they figured it out, you got moved to a different room or a different building. You thought you were going to be moved? I thought I was going to be sent back. Dr. Torres had handed Reverie a stress ball. Can you squeeze this for me while we talk about hard things? Reverie had taken it, squeezing rhythmically. Being sent back would be very scary. It would be the worst thing. Because I love my daddy so much. And my mama. And I don't want to go back to being alone. Reverie, has your daddy ever said he was going to send you back? No. Has he ever threatened it? No. So where did the idea come from? Reverie had squeezed the ball harder. From me. From my brain. Because I know how it works. I know that kids like me are temporary sometimes. And I heard Daddy on the phone and I thought he was checking on me. Like checking if I was still good enough to keep. Dr. Torres had looked at Dax. Would you like to respond to that? Dax had gotten down on the floor, sitting cross-legged next to his daughter. Reverie, look at me. She'd turned those enormous dark eyes to him. You are not temporary. You are not conditional. You are not on trial. You are my daughter, period. The phone call you heard was me working to bring your brother here, to make our family bigger, not smaller. Do you understand? I understand with my brain, Reverie had said. But my heart still gets scared sometimes. That's okay. Dax had pulled her close. Scared is allowed. Scared is normal. But when you feel scared, I need you to tell me instead of keeping it inside. Can you do that? I'll try. That's all I ask. Try. And I'll try too. I'll try to show you every single day that you're wanted. Deal? Deal. The session had continued for another 30 minutes, with Dr. Torres giving them tools to communicate, a feelings chart for Reverie to point to when words were hard, a promise from Dax to have weekly one-on-one time that was just for them, no phones, no distractions, a commitment to family meetings where everyone could voice concerns without judgment. When they'd left, Reverie had slipped her hand into Dax's. Daddy? Yes, little bird. I'm glad we're going to talk more. I have a lot of feelings. Sometimes they're too big for my body. I know exactly what you mean. She'd looked up at him, surprised. You have big feelings too? The biggest. I'm just learning how to let them out instead of keeping them locked up. Can we learn together? I'd like that very much. The fifth thing he did was plan Santiago's arrival with Reverie's input. He'd initially thought it would be a surprise, but Dr. Torres had suggested involving Reverie in the process. Give her agency. Let her feel like an active participant in growing the family, not just a recipient of decisions made about her. So one Saturday morning, Dax had spread out photos and documents about Santiago on the kitchen table. Reverie had climbed into the chair beside him, her eyes wide. This is your brother, Dax had said, pointing to the most recent photo. Santiago Reeves. He's 10 years old. He likes soccer and drawing, and he's really good at math. He looks like me. Reverie had breathed. Same nose. Same eyes, same beautiful brown skin, same courageous heart. Reverie had touched the photo gently. Does he know about me? He knows he has a sister, but he doesn't know we found you, or that we're bringing him here. So it's a surprise? A big one. Reverie had been quiet, studying the photo. What if he doesn't like me? What if he's mad that I got adopted first? Those are really good questions, Dax had validated. How about we write him a letter? You can introduce yourself. Tell him about our family. And I can include it with the paperwork. So when he's told about the adoption, he'll also have something from you. Reverie had nodded eagerly. I could tell him about my room, and how he can have his own room, and about Mama's pancakes, and about the park where we feed the ducks. All excellent things to include. They'd spent 2 hours on that letter. Reverie had written it in her careful third-grade handwriting, decorating the margins with drawings of their house, their family, the ducks at the park. Dax had watched her pour love into every sentence, and he'd felt something shift in his chest. This was what family looked like. Not perfection, not transactions, just people choosing each other over and over again. The sixth thing he did was confront Gerald Chen, not publicly, not through lawyers, but personally. He'd shown up at Gerald's office unannounced. Walked past the protests of assistants and secretaries straight into the corner office where Gerald had been on a phone call. I'll call you back, Gerald had said into the phone, his face going pale when he saw Dax. Dax had closed the door behind him. We need to talk. I'm very busy, Holloway. Dax had pulled the anonymous letter from his pocket. Dropped it on Gerald's desk. Did you write this yourself, or did you hire someone? Gerald had barely glanced at it. I don't know what you're talking about. Let me be clear, Dax had said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made Gerald lean back in his chair. You tried to destroy my family. You tried to plant seeds of doubt about my wife and daughter because I wouldn't give you what you wanted. That's not business. That's personal. Your paranoia is showing. My clarity is showing. Dax had leaned forward, palms flat on the desk. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay away from my family. You're going to stop spreading rumors. And you're going to pray that I'm more merciful than you deserve. Or what? You'll destroy my company? Gerald had tried for bravado, but his voice shook. Go ahead. We both know you play dirty when you need to. I don't need to destroy your company. Dax had straightened. You're doing that yourself. I've seen your numbers. You've got maybe 6 months before you're filing for bankruptcy. But here's the thing. I was considering throwing you a lifeline. A small acquisition deal that would have saved your employees' jobs and given you a soft landing. Was considering? Past tense. Because you went after my family. And that's a line you don't cross. Dax had walked to the door, then paused. Oh, and Gerald? If I ever hear my daughter's name in your mouth again, if I ever catch wind of you spreading poison about my wife, I won't use business tactics. I'll use personal ones. And you really don't want to see what that looks like. He'd left Gerald sitting there, and he'd felt no satisfaction. No triumph. Just exhaustion. Because this was what he'd spent 20 years doing. Playing chess with people's lives, turning everything into strategy and competition. He was done. The seventh thing he did was smaller but somehow more significant than everything else. He cleared out his home office. For years, that room had been his sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, custom mahogany desk that cost more than a car, walls lined with awards and photos from business events. It had been impressive, intimidating, designed to remind anyone who entered that Dax Holloway was important. He'd taken it all down. The awards went into storage. The photos came off the walls. He'd replaced the imposing desk with a large table, added comfortable chairs, brought in art supplies and books, and a board game collection. When Paloma had found him rearranging furniture, she'd stopped in the doorway. What are you doing? Converting my office into a family room, Dax had said. Somewhere we can all be together. Somewhere that doesn't smell like corporate ambition and neglect. You loved this room. I loved what it represented. Success, power, proof that I'd made it. But I don't need proof anymore. I need connection. Paloma had walked into the room, running her hand along the new table. This is big enough for puzzles. And homework, and art projects, and family game nights. She'd turned to him. You're really doing this. Changing everything. I'm trying. Is it working? Ask me in 6 months, Paloma had said. But I will say this. I see you, really see you, for the first time in a long time. When I look at you, you're looking back. 2 days before Santiago's arrival, Reverie had a breakdown. It was evening. They'd been going through her closet, sorting clothes to give to Santiago, when she'd suddenly stopped, dropped the shirt she'd been holding, and burst into tears. Paloma had rushed in. Baby, what's wrong? What happened? What if he's better than me? Reverie had sobbed. What if Daddy likes him more? What if he's smarter or funnier or less scared of the dark? Dax had sat down on the floor, pulled Reverie into his lap. Where is this coming from? I'm the practice kid, she'd cried. I'm the one you learned on. But Santiago is the one you chose when you knew what you were doing. Oh, little bird. Dax had rocked her gently. That's not how it works. But you adopted me because Mama asked you to. You're adopting Santiago because you want to. Is that what you think? Reverie had nodded against his chest. Paloma had sat down beside them. Reverie, that's not true. Not even a little bit. Dax had tilted Reverie's chin up so she was looking at him. The first time I saw you, you were sitting alone in that courtyard, drawing in the dirt with a stick. Do you remember what you were drawing? A house. Do you remember what you said when I asked you about it? Reverie had shaken her head. You said, this is the house I'm going to live in someday. It's going to have a big window so I can see the stars, and a garden for flowers, and room for a dog, even though dogs are a lot of work. Dax had smiled at the memory. You were 6 years old, and you were planning your future with such certainty, such hope. Even though you had every reason to believe good things wouldn't happen for you. I remember now, Reverie had whispered. I fell in love with you in that moment. Not because Mama asked me to. Because you showed me what courage looks like. You showed me that hope is a choice, not a feeling. And I thought, this is the kind of person I want to learn from. This is the kind of person I want in my family. Really? Really. And Santiago? I'm bringing him here for you, because every time I saw you look at the photos, you lit up. Because you deserve to have your brother. Because our family isn't complete without him. But make no mistake, little bird, you are not the practice kid. You're the kid who taught me how to be a father. You're the reason I know how to do this at all. Reverie had cried harder, but these were different tears. Relief tears, release tears. Mama. She'd reached for Paloma. Is that true? It's absolutely true. Paloma had pulled her close. You're not in competition with Santiago, baby. You're both expanding our capacity to love. There's not a finite amount. It grows with each person we add. What if I'm not a good big sister? Then you'll learn. Just like Daddy is learning to be a better father, just like I'm learning to be a better mother, we're all works in progress. They'd sat there on Reverie's bedroom floor, the three of them tangled together, until her tears had subsided, until she'd fallen asleep against Dax's chest, exhausted from the emotional storm. He'd carried her to bed, tucked her in, sat beside her for a long time, watching her sleep and marveling at the resilience of children. How they could carry such enormous fears in such small bodies. How they could be wounded and still choose to hope. The night before Santiago arrived, Dax couldn't sleep. He'd gotten up around 2 a.m., careful not to wake Paloma, and wandered into what used to be his office, the family room now. He'd been sitting in the dark when he'd heard footsteps. Reverie appeared in the doorway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Can't sleep either? Dax had asked. She'd shaken her head, climbed into the chair beside him. Nervous? Really nervous. What if I say the wrong thing? What if he thinks I'm weird? Then he'll fit right into this family because we're all a little weird. Reverie had smiled at that. Daddy, can I ask you something? Anything. When you were in foster care, did you ever have a brother or sister, like other kids in the homes? Sometimes. Did you ever wish you could keep them? When you had to leave? All the time. There was a boy named Marcus in my third placement. We were both 8. We told each other we were brothers, even though we didn't look alike. When I got moved to a different home, I cried for a week. Reverie had been quiet. Then, that's why you're bringing Santiago. Because you know what it's like to lose a sibling. Partly, but mostly I'm bringing him because you deserve to have what I never did. A permanent family. A brother who isn't going anywhere. Roots instead of constant upheaval. Do you think he'll like it here? I think he'll be overwhelmed. And scared. And probably a little bit angry at first because change is hard even when it's good change. How do you know? Because that's how I felt when the Montgomerys adopted me. I was so scared of hoping that I acted out for the first 2 months. Tested every boundary. Waited for them to give up on me. But they didn't? Not at first, Dax had said quietly. Not for 11 months. Reverie had processed that. Then she'd said, "We're not going to give up on Santiago, right? Even if he's difficult? We're not going to give up on Santiago. Even if he's difficult. Even if it takes time. Even if it's hard. Promise? I promise." She'd curled up against his side. They'd sat there together in the darkness, both working through their fears, until she'd fallen asleep again. Dax had carried her back to bed for the second time that night. And as he'd tucked her in, he'd thought about the strange circularity of healing. How he was parenting the wounds he'd carried. How Reverie was learning to be a sister while processing her own abandonment. How they were all stumbling forward together, imperfect and trying. Santiago arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The international adoption coordinator had called when they'd landed at JFK. Dax, Paloma, and Reverie had driven to the agency office in Manhattan. The entire car ride, Reverie had been silent, squeezing her homemade welcome card so hard it was getting crumpled. "Are you okay?" Paloma had asked from the front seat. "What if he hates me?" "He won't hate you. But what if he does? What if he's mad that I got adopted first?" Dax had met Paloma's eyes in the rearview mirror. "Then we'll help him through it, just like we're helping you through your fears." When they'd arrived at the agency, they'd been led to a meeting room. Plain walls, comfortable furniture, toys in the corner that looked aggressively cheerful. "He'll be here in just a moment," the coordinator, a woman named Miss Patricia Kim, had said. "He's been briefed. He knows he's being adopted. He knows he has a sister. But he's still processing. Be patient." Then the door had opened, and a boy had walked in. Santiago was small for 10, thin in a way that spoke of years of inconsistent nutrition. He'd had the same dark eyes as Reverie, the same serious expression. He'd been wearing new clothes clearly bought for this occasion, but he'd held himself like he was ready to run at any moment. Behind him, a social worker had smiled encouragingly. "Santiago, this is the Holloway family, your family." Santiago had looked at each of them. His gaze had lingered on Reverie. "Your Reverie," he'd said in careful English with a Spanish accent. Reverie had nodded, unable to speak. "You're my sister?" "I'm your sister." They'd stared at each other. Two kids who'd been separated at birth, who'd spent years in parallel universes of foster care and orphanages, who'd survived, who were now standing in the same room, trying to process the impossible. Then Santiago had said something in Spanish, quietly, almost to himself. Paloma had translated softly. He said, "I thought they made you up. I thought you were a story they told me to make me feel better." Reverie had stepped forward. She'd held out her welcome card. "It's messy. I made it for you. It has drawings of our house, and your room, and the park, and Mama's pancakes. But I'm not a good drawer, so they kind of look like blobs." Santiago had taken the card, studied it carefully. Then he'd looked up at Dax. "You're the dad?" "I am." "You're rich?" "I have money, yes." "Why do you want me?" The question had hung in the air. Honest, brutal, fair. Dax had knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. "Because Reverie is your sister, and she needs you. And because I know what it's like to be in the system, to feel temporary, to wonder if anyone will ever choose you. And I'm choosing you. Not because you're perfect, not because you'll be easy, but because you're family. And family doesn't leave each other behind." Santiago's jaw had tightened. "You don't know me. Not yet. But I'd like to. What if I'm bad? What if I break things or get in fights or fail school? Then we'll deal with it. Together. What if I run away? Then I'll find you and bring you home. What if I don't want to come? Then we'll talk about why. And we'll figure it out." Santiago had looked at Reverie again. "You really want a brother?" I really want my brother. Something in Santiago's face had cracked. The defensive walls had wavered. I thought about you every day. At the home. I used to pretend you were there. That we were together. Me too. Reverie had started crying. I used to make up stories about you. About what you were like. About the adventures we'd have. Santiago had dropped his small backpack, crossed the distance between them, and hugged his sister for the first time in 7 years. They'd both dissolved into tears, holding each other like lifelines. Like proof that they were real. That this was real. Dax had felt Paloma's hand slip into his. She'd been crying too, and when he'd looked around the room, even Miss Kim and the social worker had been wiping their eyes. The ride home had been quiet. Santiago had sat in the back seat next to Reverie, their hands clasped tightly. He'd stared out the window at Manhattan sliding past, his expression unreadable. When they'd arrived at the penthouse, his eyes had gone wide. This is where we live? This is home, Dax had said. It's too big. It's exactly the right size for our family. Reverie had grabbed Santiago's hand. Come on, I'll show you your room. It's right next to mine. And there's a bathroom that connects them. So we basically share it. But Daddy said you can decorate however you want. She'd pulled him inside, chattering nervously. And Dax had watched them go. His heart so full it physically ached. That first week had been hard. Santiago had been polite. Almost painfully so. He'd said please and thank you. He'd eaten whatever was put in front of him. He'd gone to bed without protest. But there'd been a guardedness to him. A waiting. He's expecting the other shoe to drop. Dr. Torres had explained in an emergency session Dax had scheduled. He's waiting to be sent back. This is too good to be true, so he's bracing for the inevitable disappointment. How do we show him it's real? Time, consistency, don't make promises you can't keep. Follow through on everything. And most importantly, when he tests you, because he will test you, don't react with anger or punishment, react with understanding. The test had come on day 9. Dax had gotten up early to make breakfast. He'd come into the kitchen to find Santiago standing at the terrace door. The door that led to a 30-story drop. The door that was supposed to be locked. Santiago had looked at him. The door was unlocked. I could have jumped, but you didn't. Dax had said calmly, even though his heart was racing. I thought about it. Why didn't you? Santiago had shrugged. Reverie would be sad. Dax had walked over slowly, sat down on the floor near the door, patted the space beside him. Santiago had hesitated, then sat. Want to tell me what's going on? This isn't real, Santiago had said. People like you don't adopt kids like me. Kids like you? Broken kids, kids with problems. I have nightmares. I wet the bed sometimes. I get in fights. I'm behind in school. None of that changes the fact that you're my son. You'll change your mind. They always do. Who's they? The couple before. The ones in Guatemala City. They were going to adopt me. Had me for 6 months. Then they found out I have ADHD. Said I was too much work. Sent me back. Dax had felt rage build in his chest. Not at Santiago. At every adult who'd ever made this boy feel disposable. I'm not sending you back. You say that now. I'm going to say it every day for the rest of your life until you believe me. Santiago had been quiet. Then, I broke your fancy vase. Yesterday. The blue one in the hallway. I was running and I bumped the table and it fell. I hid the pieces under my bed. Okay. That's it? Just okay? Did you break it on purpose? No. Then it was an accident. Accidents happen. But it was expensive. It was a thing. Things can be replaced. You can't. Santiago had looked at him, studied his face, searching for the lie, the catch. I'm serious, Santiago. You are not on trial here. You're home. The boy had started crying. Silent tears streaking down his face. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be part of a family. Neither did I, Dax had admitted. But we'll figure it out together. They'd sat there on the floor as the sun rose over Manhattan. And something had shifted. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. 3 months later, on a random Saturday morning, Dax had woken to chaos. He'd come into the kitchen to find Santiago and Reverie covered in flour. The kitchen looked like a bakery had exploded. And Paloma was supervising with amused exasperation. "What's happening?" Dax had asked. "We're making you breakfast," Reverie had announced. "It's Father's Day. Father's Day is in June. It's October." "We know," Santiago had said, his English much improved. "But we didn't know you in June, so we're having it now." They'd made pancakes. Terrible. Lumpy. Burnt in some places and raw in others pancakes. They'd served them with so much pride. And Dax had eaten every bite, even the ones that tasted like flour paste. After breakfast, they'd presented him with cards. Reverie's was covered in glitter and drawings. Santiago's was simpler but no less meaningful. Inside, in careful handwriting, it said, "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for keeping me. Thank you for being my dad." Dax had held that card and thought about the journey. About the test he'd devised 6 months ago. About how close he'd come to destroying everything because he'd been too broken to recognize love when it was offered freely. He'd thought about Marcus and Gerald and the anonymous letter, about the Montgomerys and the 14-year-old boy who'd been returned, about all the ways fear had ruled his life. And then he'd looked around at his family, his wife, who'd loved him through his worst, his daughter who'd made 100 reasons to stay, his son who'd learned to hope again, all of them imperfect, all of them healing, all of them choosing each other. That night, after the kids were in bed, Dax had found Paloma on the terrace. "I never thanked you," he'd said. "For what?" "For staying. When I gave you every reason to leave." Paloma had turned to face him. "You know why I stayed? Tell me." "Because underneath all that fear and testing and paranoia, I could still see the man who braided a little girl's hair in an orphanage. The man who learned Spanish in 3 months. The man who cried when the adoption was finalized. That man was worth fighting for. Even when he didn't fight for himself. Especially then." Dax had pulled her close. "I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. I know. I'm still learning. Still working through things in therapy. Still making mistakes. I know that too. But I want you to know. Every single day I wake up grateful. Grateful you saw something in me worth saving." Paloma had kissed him. "We saved each other, love. That's what partners do." From inside, they'd heard laughter. Santiago and Reverie, who were supposed to be asleep, giggling about something in Reverie's room. "We should tell them to go to bed," Paloma had said. "Probably. Are we going to?" "Not yet. Let them have this." They'd stood there, listening to their children laugh. And Dax had thought about the title of Reverie's book, 100 Reasons to Keep Me. He'd realized she'd had it backwards. She wasn't the one who needed to prove her worth. She'd given him 100 reasons to become a better man. 100 opportunities to choose love over fear. 100 moments that had transformed him from a billionaire who had everything but was emotionally bankrupt into a father who was rich in the only currency that actually mattered. Trust, connection, family. 6 months after that, Dax had stood in front of a room full of business students at Columbia University. He'd been invited to give a lecture on building successful companies, but he'd talked about something else entirely. "I spent 20 years measuring success in stock prices and acquisitions," he'd told the room full of future executives. "I built a $7 billion company. I won every award. I was on every power list. And I was empty." He'd paused, looked out at the young faces hanging on his every word. "The most successful thing I ever did was learn to fail. To admit I was wrong. To tear down the walls I'd built and let people in. The most profitable investment I ever made was in therapy and family dinners and showing up even when I was scared." He'd pulled out his wallet, shown them the crumpled piece of paper he carried everywhere now. "This is my daughter's handwriting. She wrote 100 reasons to keep her because she thought I was going to send her back. Because I'd been so busy protecting myself from imaginary threats that I'd made my own child feel disposable." He'd let that land. "Here's what they don't teach you in business school. You can have all the money in the world and still be poor. You can control entire markets and still be powerless. You can win every negotiation and still lose what matters most." A student had raised her hand. "So, what's the lesson?" "The lesson is this. Test your assumptions, not your people. Trust isn't naive, it's courageous. And the relationships you build with integrity will always be more valuable than the ones you build with strategy." Another student. But don't you need to protect yourself? In business and in life, protect yourself from genuine threats, yes. But don't confuse protection with isolation. Don't confuse caution with paranoia. And don't ever, ever test the people you love to see if they'll fail. Because the only person who fails in that scenario is you. The lecture had gone viral, not because of business insights, but because it was real, raw, human. Dax had received hundreds of messages. From other parents, from adopted kids, from people who'd been tested by their partners and had the language to finally name the violation, from men who saw themselves in his story and were brave enough to seek help. He'd even received a message from Marcus Stahl, his old competitor. Short, simple. I owe you an apology for what I said at that gala. I was projecting my own misery onto you. For what it's worth, you've inspired me to do better. Dax had stared at that message for a long time. Then he'd deleted it. Not out of anger, but because he'd learned that forgiveness didn't require maintaining connection. Some people belonged in your past. The message he'd kept was from a young man named Marcus. Different Marcus. A kid who'd been in foster care and had just been adopted at age 15. Your story gave me hope, it said. Thank you for being honest about how hard it is. Thank you for showing that broken people can become good parents. I'm scared I'll mess this up, but you messed up and your kids still love you. So maybe there's hope for me too. Dax had written back. There's absolutely hope. The fact that you're worried about messing up means you care enough to get it right, and that's the only prerequisite for being a good parent. On the 1-year anniversary of Santiago's adoption, the family had gone back to Guatemala, not just for vacation, but for purpose. Dax had used a portion of his wealth to establish the Reverie in Santiago Foundation. Its mission was simple: support families willing to adopt older children, provide therapy for adopted kids, fund programs that kept siblings together in the foster system. The foundation's headquarters was in Guatemala City. On the day of the opening, Santiago and Reverie had cut the ribbon together. This is for all the kids who think they're too old, Reverie had said into the microphone, reading from a speech she'd written herself. Or too broken, or too much. You're not. You're exactly enough. Santiago had taken the microphone. His English was almost perfect now. 1 year ago, I was in a group home. I thought I would be there forever. I thought nobody wanted kids like me. But I was wrong. And if you're watching this and you feel like I felt, I want you to know. There's a family out there for you. Don't give up. Dax had watched his children speak, watched them transform their pain into purpose, and he'd felt a pride so fierce it had brought tears to his eyes. That night, back at the hotel, Santiago had knocked on Dax and Paloma's door. Can I come in? Of course. Santiago had sat on the edge of the bed. I need to tell you something. Okay. I heard you. Last year, when you pretended to sleep, Dax's blood had run cold. What? The night before I came to New York. The coordinator told me about the family adopting me. She said the dad had been testing everyone because he was scared. She said you overheard him admit it to his wife. Dax had glanced at Paloma. She'd looked equally shocked. Miss Kim told you that? She thought I should know. In case you did it again. In case you tested me. Dax had felt shame wash over him. Santiago, But here's the thing. Santiago had interrupted. I'm glad you did it. You're glad? Because it means you're human. It means you're scared too. Every time I mess up or get angry or push boundaries, I'm testing to see if you'll send me back, so I can't be mad at you for doing the same thing. That's not the same, isn't it? We're all just scared people trying not to get hurt again. Dax had pulled his son into a hug. When did you get so wise? I had a good teacher. They'd held each other, and Dax had realized that healing wasn't linear, wasn't perfect. It was just showing up every day and choosing connection over fear. Over and over again, until one day you looked up and realized you'd built something real. 5 years later, Dax stood in Reverie's high school gymnasium watching her graduation. She was 17 now, confident, brilliant. She'd been accepted to every college she'd applied to. She'd chosen Berkeley, following in Paloma's footsteps, planning to study international development. Her valedictory speech had been about family, about what it means to be chosen, about the difference between being adopted and being found. "I used to think love was something you earned," she'd said from the podium, "something you had to be perfect enough to deserve. But my dad taught me something better. He taught me that love is something you choose, every single day, even when it's hard, even when you're scared, even when you don't know what you're doing." She'd look directly at Dax in the audience. "Dad, I know you're going to cry. It's okay. You always cry at the important stuff." The audience had laughed. Dax had wiped his eyes, unashamed. 13 years ago, you met a scared little girl in an orphanage, and you chose her. Not because she was perfect, but because you saw something in her worth nurturing. And that choice changed everything. It gave me a family, a future, a belief that I mattered. She'd paused. "So to every kid out there who feels temporary, who feels like they're too much or not enough, I want you to know something. You're waiting for the right people. The ones who will choose you not despite your flaws, but with full knowledge of them. And when you find them, let them in. Trust them, even when it's terrifying." After the ceremony, the family had gathered for photos. Dax, Paloma, Reverie, and Santiago, now 15 and taller than everyone else. "One more," the photographer had called. "Everyone squeeze in." They'd huddled together. And just before the flash, Reverie had whispered, "Hey Dad, remember that book I made? The 100 Reasons? How could I forget? I was wrong. There's really only one reason you needed." "What's that?" "Because I'm yours. And you're mine. And that's how family works." The camera had flashed, capturing a moment. A family. A journey from broken to whole. That photo still sat on Dax's desk. Not in a corporate office, but in the family room. The room that used to be about power and was now about connection. And sometimes, late at night, when he couldn't sleep, Dax would look at that photo and think about the test. About the night he'd pretended to sleep. About how close he'd come to destroying everything. He'd learned that the real test wasn't what people did when they thought you weren't watching. It was what you did with the love they offered when you were. Paloma had stayed. Reverie had hoped. Santiago had trusted. And Dax had finally learned to accept the gift he'd spent a lifetime believing he didn't deserve. Family. Real, messy, imperfect, permanent family. That was the lesson. That was the transformation. That was the answer to a test he should never have given. And it had been worth every painful step of the journey to get there. So here's what I want you to take away from this. If you're watching this and you've been testing the people you love, stop. Just stop. Talk to them instead. Get therapy. Do the hard work of healing your wounds before you wound the people who love you. And if you're the one being tested, know this. You don't have to prove your worth. You don't have to earn love. Real love isn't something you achieve. It's something you receive and reciprocate. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own relationships, I need you to do 3 things. First, smash that like button. Let me know this resonated. Second, drop a comment telling me what lesson hit home for you. What part of this story are you carrying with you? And third, subscribe to this channel, because we're building a community here. A place where real stories about real struggles lead to real healing. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. With someone who's been tested, or someone who's doing the testing. Because sometimes we need a mirror to see ourselves clearly. And sometimes that mirror is a story about a billionaire who almost lost everything by trying to protect himself from nothing. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, the people who love you aren't your enemies. They're your greatest investment. Treat them accordingly.